Hi, my name is Shanshan. I sell art on shanshan.co. Today we're going to review Oppenheimer. So it's a film by Christopher Nolan. Time is 3 hours, which is really excessive, I think. I think he could have done this maybe in 2.5. Would it take quite a lot of editing to get there, but maybe it's possible to get it to 2.5 versus I usually like an hour and a half. These kind of historical novels or historical events put to real tests kind of require a little bit more time because you're talking a lot of characters. So yeah, there was a little bit there. Actors are Cillian Murphy plays Robert Oppenheimer. Emily Blunt plays Kitty Oppenheimer, his wife. Robert Downey Jr. plays Louis Strauss, the villain behind Oppenheimer's demise later in the film. Alden Ehrenreich plays the Senate aide. Florence Pugh plays Jean Tatlock, a former flame of Robert Oppenheimer. So it starts off, Oppenheimer is going to school all over Europe because that's where the best schools on physics are in the time, in the 20s and the 30s. So he runs into Germans, scientists, Dutch scientists, English scientists. And so later he's called to work on the atomic bomb in Los Alamos. He's also protesting some of the rights of academia to kind of unionize. Like you saw later, there's academic unions that have formed later that protect, professors from being fired and those kind of things, which there's downsides to it as well. But he's one of the key elements, but that's closely connected to communism at the time. Later that becomes a huge issue and he's drawn to a trial with Louis Strauss trying to take down Oppenheimer behind the scenes, which is kind of the final part of the film. So it's a huge story to tell. Obviously, there's millions of cameos in this film of various actors that kind of backfill all the different parts and people that touched Oppenheimer's lives and filmed the kind of basis of this story from his youth all the way to the Los Alamos to the trial. So you have kind of 3 acts, obviously, to the film. So there's a lot of different characters here. They could have simplified a little bit, but then it would have been obviously considered more fiction versus, so it's always difficult to make that choice as a director. Do you include all the historical figures or not? What do you add? What do you take out? So maybe 3 hours is justified, but considering there's no break at all in the film, if they had added like a little intermission, which they used to do in like the 30s, 40s, which people haven't seen in decades, but they used to do this in films where they break a film, give it 10, 15 minutes, and then people come back. You can reorder snacks, come back to the film. And that would have made, I think, this film a little more palatable, being 3 hours. 1.5 hours is fine. That people's most platters survive, but luckily, I planned ahead of time. I didn't drink anything for an hour before this film, so I had drank very little, maybe a Coke and a coffee in the morning. So I only ate during the cinema. I said, Dad, don't bring any drinks, but, my dad's a lot older, so he had to go to the bathroom. So I think a lot of people, especially the seniors seeing the film, are going to miss key sections of the film. I don't think you miss that much because the film is so long. So it all kind of stitches together, even if you do miss a part here or two. The only part you probably don't want to miss is the atomic bomb dropping. That's pretty cool. There's some time lapses back and forth in the film, classic Christopher Nolan style. I'm not sure if they really need it in this film. It's kind of cool, but it doesn't really make sense to me. I don't think it added much. I think it was kind of a cool, like, oh, this is Christopher Nolan's technique, but I don't know if you needed that much foreshadowing in the film per se. So I think you could have just shot it almost all chronological and have a couple flashback things, or pre-flashes foreshadowing, but I don't know if you needed as many as he used in the film. He didn't use too many, so it's mostly chronological, but it's just kind of like he threw in the touch because that's his style, so I don't know if it's necessary here. There's an interesting take on the trial of Oppenheimer, which they kind of foreshadow a little bit in the beginning, which is probably necessary for this part of the film because I didn't even know about this, that Oppenheimer was grilled. But it makes sense in the McCarthy era that, suspicions would arise post-war when Soviets became our allies to immediately to our enemy. And then anyone that had any communist leanings during the 20s, 30s when it was more laissez-faire with communists, before the atrocities of Stalin had really come out, people thought, oh, communism is another way to do government, right? And then later, the horrors of Stalin and Lenin's genocides that they committed in their own countries started to come out, and people were like, Jesus Christ, it's horrible. But at the time, people were kind of seen more neutral in communism, or they thought it was more propaganda that was coming out against communism. So it was kind of people really on the fence, and you really have that kind of impact in the film, which is really nice to see these early historical figures early in their lives. They might have had connections to communists, and how deep they were connected determined the effect on if they would do well in the 60s. Some people had to flee the country completely. So there's a really devastating effect on the American public, depending on where you fell on this spectrum. So it's really interesting because that really happens in real life. You can see people that were, I don't know, maybe say anti-gay in the past, and now that comes to haunt them now that there's more gay rights that would probably haunt them if they were, an actor or a director or like an academia or some big, huge organization where there's multiple layers to who you have to kind of grease the wheels to get and survive in a career. So that really has an impact on people's careers. I felt it myself working 2 jobs, 5 years each, and there's a lot of tension that builds over 5 years of they didn't pay me on time, they didn't get my raise on time, this person got special effects, I didn't get stock options. This kind of like stuff just rises up and boils to the top eventually. So there is a lot of that, especially in academia. I saw it with my dad. He's a professor, so there was just, I mean, he's told me some horror stories of what happened. People just flame out their career-wise when they kind of rose to the top, and then they weren't a good leader, and then they just got pushed out completely, and you're like, well, they were still a good teacher. But it didn't matter. So that's kind of interesting, and you see this big tension with the trial of Oppenheimer at the end of the film. There's some things that are missing from the film. There's no real Japanese footage of the bombing of Nagasaki and Hiroshima, which they could have used, or the effects of the victims, which they could have used. They did kind of subtly show it, but they kind of downplayed it a lot. Like Oppenheimer would have these visions of people's skin flaking out, but it was way, way worse than that. And I think you kind of really show some of the horrors of atomic bombing in reality. That would really kind of solidify in the film, like, holy crap, this is a horrible thing they developed. But at the same time, how do you frame it against? Another thing that's missing is they don't show the bombing of Pearl Harbor, which has been a huge film in itself. Obviously, it's been done before. And you obviously can't add that onto Oppenheimer. It would be like hundreds and hundreds of millions to do that, and it would make the film like 6 hours or something. But to have snippets of Pearl Harbor and you really have to gel the U.S. public where they were at the time and why they went into World War II suddenly. Like before, they're kind of on the fence, and they're like, screw it, let's go to war. And this was one of the key events. The atrocities of the concentration camps is also missing here, which is really the impetus for why America fought against the Nazis and then eventually against the Japanese with the bombing of Pearl Harbor. So those are real key events which makes sense to me as a history major and makes sense now. Most people understand those events. But decades from now, that's not going to make the connection as well, and it kind of downplays the real fear of atomic war. I think people will definitely get some kind of understanding on it, but I think, the farther we get away from that and the more it's seen as safe or there hasn't been an atomic war, people are like, oh, we're crazy back then. I think they could have shown probably some of the atomic testings of the Atoll Islands. You could have shown the real life, like you had Donald Trump launched a missile into the islands just recently, and that would have been like, oh my God, these are the real life events that are going to play out, which they kind of suggest in the film, but they could have used real footage. You could have the Tsar bomb, which was one of the biggest bombs ever dropped in mankind by the Soviets, which really drove a lot of tension into the Cold War. You had the Cuban Missile Crisis, obviously in the 60s, that would have been very close to this era as well. So there's a lot of missing historical elements that would have really built this story up, but it's 3 hours. What do you cut? What do you add? It would have been kind of nice to have kind of those, the Japanese bombing Pearl Harbor, somehow that, maybe just a newspaper flash and how people felt, and the anger that really stirred in people. It really justified like why there was such an impetus on Los Alamos. Also, the concentration camps would have had an impact of why they had to beat the Nazis to the atomic bomb, because it would have been a horrifying thing. The Nazis would have won, and obviously they would have killed off all the Jews and minorities in all of Eastern Europe. And that would have been a really horrible thing. So it's just really interesting how that kind of plays out, the tensions. Also, the Stalin gulags are missing from this, which builds the tension of why the Americans went from allies to Stalin to like, oh my God, this guy's a psychopath. He's killed millions of people. We got to get rid of this from our society. And the real paranoia that spun around communism was really real, and it was a real dangerous threat to the U.S. and the West in Europe, because the Soviet Union was gobbling up parts of Eastern Europe. They gobbled up half of Europe, converted them to communism, and it was like they were later fighting in Korea, then in Vietnam. And so there's real threats, and in Cuba, obviously, Cuban Missile Crisis. So there's a lot of historical events that are kind of missing, that kind of, ripple down the sands of time, so to say. So they kind of suggested in the film, which I guess maybe you had to take a shortcut there. But I think if you showed the real bombings and real terror that had it would really have it would gel the film like really hardcore, I think, to the atomic blast being the scare of a time, and then now relevance to the audience now. I think you could have added that, and it would have added a lot to the film. They have a funny dig at the very end about JFK voting against the Strauss, and he was getting appointed to be a Secretary of Agriculture or something in the Eisenhower administration. So a very subtle dig that the deep state was behind JFK assassination, which I think most people now agree that's probably what happened, because they blacklisted it for decades, and there'd be no reason for the Soviets to hide the fact that if they were behind it, they would have just said, yeah, we killed him. We own it, dude. Like they had the bones of Hitler right on display in the KGB, right? So, they were going to entomb Hitler and make him like a mausoleum display piece. That's why Hitler burned himself alive. Oh, not alive, but he burned himself, you know, so he wouldn't be captured by the Soviets, but his body was captured anyway with the skeleton, supposedly. So yeah, a lot of different elements here. I think he had some difficult choices as a director to cut down what parts of the his story do you comment on, which do you skim out. Yeah, it's just hard to say what you could have added and taken away from this film as far as, you know, there's no Pearl Harbor, there's no the Nazi concentration camps, there's no the Soviet bombings afterwards and the testings where the Soviet race with the US, and they could have kind of shown that a little bit, like this leads to that and that leads to this, and but at the time, I guess Oppenheimer, he wouldn't have foresaw exactly what it would lead, but he would know it would lead at some point to an atomic warfare. So I guess that's kind of boiled down to what you could have shown in a film. I really overall liked the film. You know, I think I might have made different choices if I was a director as far as some of the more historical references, I think, to really build the film more of like tension, because in decades to come, like 20, 30, 40, 60 years ago, people are going to see this film and they're not going to realize the real tension that existed in the 60s, the 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s about the fear of atomic war was a very real threat. You know, it recently kind of came up under Trump and Putin and everything, so it's kind of coming back a little bit as well. But, you know, that is really a crucial element to this film, I think, that's kind of missing a little bit. And, you know, the impetuous for fighting World War II, about the Nazi concentration camps, invading all over. They could have kind of showed that, like with the newspaper flash. They invaded Poland, they invaded Czechoslovakia, they invaded here. Oh, the Nazis are killing people here. Oh, there might be camps in Germany. Oh, but they're killing people, it's horrible. And then later, oh, it comes out that Stalin had gulags and they're killing people. Oh, we got to fight the communists. Why are we fighting the communists? There's all these elements are kind of missing. Just the fear of, you know, communism, but not really that. There's actually a real reason why people hate the communists and the real tension. And it's kind of also, it kind of exposed a little bit Hollywood left leaning as far as thinking the left is always good. And that's not always the case, because there are some good ideas in the left, but there's some really horrible ideas that have tried out in other socialist countries. And if people don't know, Nazism is kind of a form of socialism. It has socialism in the name, so it's really kind of a socialist dictatorship, but just in a little bit different way than socialism in a way when socialism veers into communism and becomes a dictatorship. They aren't that too far apart, so it's really interesting there politically, but obviously that probably is a little bit too dicey to explain in this film, but yeah, I think that could have given a little bit more weight to the film, especially the horrors of atomic film with the real-life bombings and how the people felt. And yeah, there's also the missing element of the Japanese internment camps that were kind of sidelined right at the same time of Los Alamos, which would have really kind of tied together that underlying, like, ew, where's the U.S. going kind of feel. So there's a lot of missing elements that Nolan might have been able to kind of add somehow and cut back on the personal stories and add more of the historical things. But, you know, people go to films for the personal story, not necessarily just a history lesson. So, you know, there's a lot of different difficult decisions to be made with this film when you cut it together. That's my review. Hope you guys like it. If you guys would like to see more, you can subscribe below, and I'll see you on the next one. Thanks for watching, guys.